Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I request you to settle down? Our guest for the morning is here already. Thank you so much, Mr. Ravi, for joining us. So when we announced this session, obviously we didn't anticipate what a week it's going to turn out to be. But having said that, we are really, really delighted and appreciative for you to be here with us, despite everything that's going on. And as at PAFI we were discussing, we have to do what we need to do to continue and support what's happening in the country. So we have to focus on our business. And therefore, the conversation today on how do we future-proof India and look at growth in the age of disruption. And when I talk of disruption, it is more in the area of trade and tariffs, not what's happened in the recent 3 days. So we are delighted to have with us Mr. Dammu Ravi, Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs. He's no stranger to PAFI members. He's been here many times before, so thank you so much, sir, for joining us again. We will have moderation by T.S. Vishwanathan, who is a founding member, past president and director general of PAFI and the founder of executive chairman of VEK. So it's an honor to have him who, with the kind of experience that he brings with the intersection of foreign policy and economic diplomacy, which has helped steer India through many shifting global currents. And especially in this time, it's even more imperative to hear from him and his insights. We're obviously meeting at a time when the world is marked by deep and, if I may say so, dynamic, ever-changing disruption. No day is the same. And from the resurgence of protectionist policies, such as the tariffs by the Trump administration, and of course the heightening of geopolitical tensions, it's going to be even more important for us to be more resilient and strategic in our foresight. And we believe India is at the right time and place to be able to take advantage and be sort of emerge in this global order. So without much further ado, I also just want to add, the role of PAFI is really to bring together public-private partnerships, because in this time when the government alone cannot future-proof the country and look at our growth, nor can the businesses navigate these disruptions without the vision and guidance of the government. So we need to look at a cooperative framework which is built on trust and synergy, and that's what PAFI has always advocated, and we believe that will be key in unlocking the potential in trade, technology, and global partnerships. So with that, I'm going to request Ajay to do a quick introduction of Mr. Ravi, and then we will kick off.
Good morning, and thank you all very much for coming today. It's interesting times, as we all know, and since last 48 hours, we were getting messages, are we going ahead, what's happening? And it's so reassuring to have Secretary Ravi at this time. We know that there are things happening around, and for him to be able to join us today as he committed is a testimony to his commitment to the economic relations. Secretary Ravi and PAFI go back almost as old as PAFI is, I think. We are 18 years old, and formally we are 14 years old. This is the 14th AGM of PAFI. And when we were informal organization, we had the privilege of Secretary Ravi coming and speaking to us. Over the last 2 years, 3 years since he's taken over as Secretary of Economic Relations, we've engaged with him. And the very fact that you have an Economic Relations Secretary of somebody of the caliber of Secretary Ravi, that reflects the importance the government gives to this portfolio. I'm not going to read his resume, but Secretary Ravi joined the Foreign Service in 1989. He's served in Latin America and in Brussels. He's worked in Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Commerce. He's handled several portfolios in the Ministry of External Affairs. And of course, handled difficult task of COVID, post-COVID, the impact and the excellent work the government and MEA did during the COVID crisis. And of course, I think he's just come back from the G20. He looks at all the multilateral issues amongst various other things. So we've requested him about 4 weeks ago when we picked up the topic, as Deepshikha said, and we had no idea what was going on, especially keeping in view the Trump effect and the tariff behavior and so on and so forth. So we've requested Secretary Ravi to speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then my colleague and friend Vish will moderate the session. We'll have plenty of time. And then Chetan, our incoming president, will close the session at about 12:15, and then we already have some speakers for the next session, which will start at 12:30. So please join me in welcoming Secretary Ravi, and I invite him to say.
Good morning to all. Ladies and gentlemen, let me at the outset thank PAFI for giving me this opportunity, and in a gathering that's so distinguished. And I see a lot of luminaries, actually, who are experts on the subject. And I'm really delighted to be here today to share my thoughts. And for the love of Ajay, it draws everybody together. Thank you, Ajay, for... It connects almost everyone, and I think friendship goes for many, many decades now. And Deepshikha, thank you for that introduction. Vish, I know Vish for a very long time. Mr. Krishna Swami too. Well, at the outset, what I thought was I'll set the context, and then we will move into question and answers. So the broad contours that we need to understand in order to talk about this subject, we have to see how the world has changed in the last 100 years or so, the post-Second World War time. And if you analyze that phase, you will broadly come to realize that there are certain trends that have influenced the changes around the world. One of which I would say is the globalization. The globalization that we understand from the time that has been coined by Theodore Levitt and Peter Sutherland, But that is not the starting point. Or the 90s, beginning of 90s or late 80s was not the starting point. It's ever since the human being invented the wheel, it started off and set a motion. And it's a technology, again, that brought the world together. It's the interdependence that is underpinning the globalization. And today there's a reaction to globalization in the form of deglobalization. It's because certain countries have taken advantage of it and certain countries have left behind. That's the sentiment there. The second is the transatlantic shifts. The tectonic shifts that have happened on the global scale in the last 50 years or so, and this is accelerated again in the 21st century, is the transatlantic to trans-Pacific. So this is the center of the economic activity, which is going to determine how the world will move in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, we have to largely recognize that the two factors and two countries that will play a major role, which is India and China. And then the shift to understanding of the world economics and the world dynamics has shifted. There's a geopolitics to geoeconomics. And this, again, 21st century is driving that change. We always thought that post-Second World War, security and military dimension are so important. Well, that is still important too, but it has been overtaken by the economic interests of nations, which is why in the foreign policy is most often is underpinned by the economic interests of nations. And every country, in every activity, every ministry and every department is beginning to shift that thinking. But we are also seeing that, as some countries have accelerated, some countries left behind, you're also seeing reactions to it in the form of nationalism. The nationalist tendencies, what we see today is increasing protectionism, that countries want to protect their industry against those that have taken advantage, those that have perhaps gamed the multilateral rule book to their advantage. So there is a reaction to that, and we had to recognize that one. There is also reaction and fear that supply chain concentration in the few hands is going to be increasingly difficult for those countries who are on the rise and looking for greater prosperity. Another important aspect of this shift we have to see is in the form of technology. Technology in the 21st century is accelerating a lot of changes and bringing about competitiveness into the center stage of the discourse on how nations will engage economically. Industrial Revolution 4.0, and more importantly, the artificial intelligence will be the key player in determining the competitiveness of nations. So the focus has to be more on how nations will manage this technology-driven competitiveness in the economies. So broadly, we will again see reactions to this. There is a geo-economic fragmentation between the competitive world, that is United States and China. So how do you manage this fragmentation? We'll have to see how nations will position themselves in the days to come. Then there is also competition in terms of the technology space itself, the decoupling from the technology. So you will have two major trends which are leading the technology competition. So I would like to then, let's focus how the world will evolve from here onwards. But increasingly we will see in this competitive world an equal world developing, an equal world in terms of those countries who are not able to keep pace will be left behind, and that is largely the global south. And what it means is that vulnerability will increase in the global south. So what is India's role, and what is the role of those rising economies which are part of this global south, and how do we manage it? We'll keep it for another session someday. Now let's look at India. I mean, I've given a context, and let's look at India and how we manage our own rise. It almost took about the post-Second World War, 3 to 4 decades, we were stuck in the Hindu growth rate, which is about 4% below, that never led the economy to actually accelerate. The 1991 reforms is a landmark reform. And then we saw growth acceleration, the economy in the boom, the private sector taking off, and you experienced a significantly a 6% growth rate on average. Of course, more than that, an average I'm saying, but 6.4 to 6% is what on average we have achieved. That has accelerated the growth. It almost took 65 years for India to achieve a $1 trillion GDP. And what happened next was it took 7 years to achieve the second $1 trillion GDP. And then it took about 3 years to achieve, 4 years to achieve the third trillion, and 3.5 years to achieve the fourth trillion. And then going at that pace, we are going to achieve more probably 2 to 2.5 years, the next 5 trillion, and about 1.5 years, you will be adding almost every trillion to the economy. That is predictable and is achievable and is doable. But that further to achieve, you need to have a growth rate as consistently at an average of 8%. And that's very securing if you're able to achieve that. So let's see how we can maintain that trajectory. But when you see this, the growth rate and the way it accelerates, it's almost like mimicking the Newton's second law of motion, which is acceleration is equal to force into mass. So the heft will create the economy, it will accelerate faster. And that is quite natural for a big economy achieving that pace. So to be able to do it below 2 years, every trillion adding to the GDP is achievable. But then you've got to have a growth consistency. Now, what are the factors that will actually matter in that rise? And how do we manage India's own rise, given that context? I'd like to draw your attention to what is known as the manufacturing part of it. And we were under the erroneous assumption for a long time that having missed the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, you would be able to leapfrog with the services sector taking a leading growth. But that is, in my view, is a very misguided thinking in the policy. You need to have clearly a manufacturing base for a country to rise. And that's important for stability and also for job. And it brings us to the very classical economist thinking, the Nicholas Kolder, which he said that no nation can be big, can raise to a significant level without achieving manufacturing base. And that's very much true. Then how do you manage that growth? We are at about 16 to 17% GDP. The manufacturing to the GDP is about 16 to 17%. It remained more or less same in the last 10 years. It did not go. So what it also tells us that growth is happening despite manufacturing not happening in the economy. And that may be because it's a top-led growth. And that's not very good for an economy of our size and a population of our size. You got to have jobs created. That's important how you manage that. Second is in terms of the supply chains. So India doesn't have its own supply chains, because if you look at our own economic activity in terms of we are still dependent a lot of supply chains and the products coming from outside. India has not developed its own supply chain activity, and it is very telling in the way we manage South Asia integration. 5% of the the trade within South Asia is 5% of the South Asia global trade is within the region. So that only shows that India, being such a large economy, still we are not able to make a dent. How do we correct this? And it takes me to again, a very classical thinking, the economist of Paul Krugman, who talked about the importance of the economic geography, which talks about the spatial manufacturing. So my hope comes from this understanding that as we build the corridors, industrial corridors, north and south and east and west and various parts, we will be able to scale it up. And we should be able to do that. And the policy will take into consideration that element of enhancing your manufacturing scale. And scale is important because also your costs will come down. And you're able to drive your supply chains your own. Notwithstanding the fact that you will continue to depend on the global supply chains. But what you can do, you should be able to secure for yourself. And this is also very strategic. Because as I said, the concentration of supply chains in one country or one region is dangerous. You will be hugely disadvantaged. And you will be at the mercy of another country if they have to switch off the supply chain network. And this is what exactly is happening in the global trade war. China can switch off the rare earth minerals for the Americans in the trade war, and that's a danger. APIs that India depends so much on China can also be at a risk tomorrow if it chooses not to supply it. So we have to be wary of these trends when you are navigating your own geopolitical tensions and competition. The reason why I said manufacturing is important is because the scale at which we need to create jobs is staggering. Almost 1 million jobs we need to create to keep your own force, the employable force, in jobs. And that's graduates coming out of your colleges and institutions. And the backlog, notwithstanding, is about 50 million. So there's a huge requirement for us to create jobs. And it brings us back to the Keynesian theory of, again, classical economists who say that the government has a responsibility and the role to create that aggregate demand. So then comes, how do you manage a job creation? That's, again, brings to the focus your MSME versus big industry. The MSME in the country are about 65 million, creating about 110 million jobs. 30% of our exports are actually driven by the MSME. And it is spread out even around the country, so which means it's also stabilizing in terms of movement of people, not having to go for search of jobs. So it's very critical, how do you balance the interests of both big industry and the MSME? So keeping that in view, again, your policies will have to cater to that balancing role. I always thought that, there is an interlinking concept we don't understand, which is trade and investments. And almost we look at it in a very segmented and in a fragmented manner. But that's not true. Investments and trade are highly interlinked. And today, in the 21st century, in an increasingly competitive environment, we have to see even more the dimension of this. Trade, investments, services, goods, e-commerce, technology, and finance. These are all interlinked concepts. This is driving the competitiveness. So we have to see this policy when you frame in a very holistic manner. And that has to be done both in consultation with the industry and the think tanks, and particularly the great minds of PAFI. It's very important that how we bring into the policy environment. For a very long time, we always thought that domestic market is good enough for us to manage our growth. But that's again a very erroneous assumption that if you are able to have economic growth and your trade is caged within the domestic environment, it's good enough. Not so. You've got to have an orientation towards exports. And if you look at the trajectory of many countries that are today leading economies in the world, they've come the same way. 60s, 70s, you see the Japan, Korea, Germany, all of them were first developed the industries and then let go. You have to have an export orientation to your trade policy. And that's very, very critical. Of course, the industry will not by itself come forward to do that. But if you are plugged in to the global dynamics and to remain competitive, that thinking may evolve. And how do we go about doing that? It's because it is important for us to constantly understand that your export competitiveness is as important as domestic stability and domestic market. So, and what are the numbers saying today? Today, the inward investments into the country are almost like $1 trillion. But what is so important and not properly understood is our outward FDIs, which is touching almost $300 billion. Just 1/3 of your investment portfolios are actually outside plugged. So it only shows that since the last 2.5 decades or 3 decades, the industry started to explode in going out. And we have not recognized that emotion and that urge of the industry to going out. Look at the mergers and acquisitions that are happening and the greenfield investments that many of the Indian companies are doing outside. That's a very healthy thing. We should actually do a facilitation that how we position these industry going out of India and be able to do it. And that should be adequately taken into account in your policy. So many people say the Atmanirbhar Bharat is again very much domestic and it has to remain within domestic. Everything you have to produce. But in my view, the dynamics of Atmanirbhar Bharat would be enhanced and are much more derivative in terms of the benefit that it can have if you have an external linkage. And that is where I feel if you're looking at Indian-owned SEZs in your neighborhood and in Africa and in neighboring regions, in extended neighborhood, is a lot more enduring. And what it leads to is economic integration of the nations is so important. It's not about creating dominance over another economy, but it's the integration of the economies is critical for countries to have a more cooperative environment than a competitive environment. This is again a very strategic thinking. And we have to nurture this in our policy. The last one I want to emphasize here is new technology focus. Something that India has done in the recent times is incredible in terms of the digital public infrastructure. These are low-cost solutions. But we are able to reap the efficiencies and ease of living, ease of doing business, and ease of governance in a big way. The fintech solutions, and these can be easily replicated in the global south. And I believe the time has come for us to focus on the technologies that are useful for the global south. The second item that I always thought important is we think most of the time that agriculture, you have to grow to save your farmers. But the time has come for also to evaluate that thinking. Because if the industrialization has to take place in a large scale, then a lot of land has to be made available. Perhaps it might make immense sense if you have to shift some of your production outside of India in areas where there are arable lands and fertile lands and large land available to create your own food stocks, food security zones, as well as for the domestic requirement and outside world. Today, there will be disruptions of the supply chains on the food chains. And this is what we have seen already in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and increasingly so in the Middle East crisis and in our own neighborhood. This will be a problem. So we'll have to think through and anticipate the change. The other important thing is the energy space, the climate change versus energy transition. This will be an important debate. India has shown the way in some way. Perhaps the gigawatt scale of solar energy parks that we've created in India can be replicated outside of India. Because the cost of energy, when it comes down, it will have a great impact on any nation's economic growth, because both development and energy are such an interlinked concept. So India can show the way in creating a gigawatt scale or a megawatt scale projects outside of India and reduce the energy production in those countries. And this is possible if you're able to tackle the regulatory frameworks and encourage countries to engage in the offtake agreements. The third important and the last item I'd like to touch upon is actually the critical minerals. The technologies of the 21st century will invariably depend on the critical minerals and the rare earths. And this is where I see intense competition developing or already developed, and it's going to grow even more faster. So India's ability to develop with semiconductors, chips, robotic engineering, artificial intelligence, even the ubiquitous gadgets that we have, it's the mobile phones, will depend on critical minerals and rare earths. But today, that equation is very skewed. China controls 70% of the global critical minerals, and the processing, 90% of it is controlled by one country, one region. And this is not healthy for those countries that are focusing on the technologies for their own economic growth. Let's also think on another part of it. We automatically assume that in the geopolitical tension and competition, that countries will automatically look to India for China plus one approach. It doesn't happen automatically until and unless you address the ecosystem challenges that you're faced with today. And what are those ecosystem challenges for investment to come in? It requires a deep understanding of how you drive it. So that's, again, another day for discussion. And I'd like to perhaps pause here and take some questions if you had any. And thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi, for providing an overview and the context in terms of the conversation we could have, and we'll get to some questions. But I had a few questions to begin with, and you actually answered most of the questions I had, so let me go to some of the other questions that I have for you. One thing which one has seen in the last, say, about 6-8 months has been the pressure on multilateral institutions. It could be the WTO, could be the UN, it's on climate change. So when you're future-proofing India, from an Indian perspective, how important do you think these institutions are, and what should be the Indian role there?
Thanks for, thank you for asking this important question. I deliberately left it there because it's for want of time. Well, the point of fact is, multilateral rules, regulations, either UN, WTO, any other institution are very important. And why these are important? These are important because it brings stability for a lot of countries, and I would say in particular to the global south. When the multilateral rules are framed, you always have that special and differential treatment. That is, countries of the global south are given certain time to catch up with the rest of the world. But today what has happened is when 2001, when China entered into it, it started to game that rule book. And that is where creating excess capacities is invariably going to cause a lot of tension, not just in the developed world, but increasingly in the developing countries which are wanting to create manufacturing facilities. So, which is why the UN, when it was created, only there were 50 countries, or less than that. Maybe now today it has gone by 3 or 4 folds. So the rule has to change dynamically to reflect the contemporary realities. That has not happened. Both in WTO and in the UN, it has not happened. Which is why today much of the debate has shifted out of the UN to the G20, and to some extent to the BRICS. Countries are looking for alternatives to be able to express themselves and find alternate solutions for their own challenges. So I believe that like-minded countries would need to work concertedly, coherently to be able to bring back the multilateral rule book onto the center stage of the debate and put development there as a focus area of discussion. Thank you.
So, do you think, what role would you think India would be playing in this whole thing?
Well, I think India is always championing the cause of the global south, and those issues are common amongst many countries. These are developmental challenges, and we believe that we can play a facilitative role, a role that is more endearing to the global south. And we are a country that, again, we are able to talk to both sides, the developed West, the big powers to small powers. So that kind of, India has a unique role to play. So you can construct a rule book that is able to address all the concerns of both the developed countries and also the developing countries.
Thank you for saying that, because you mentioned Global South a couple of times in what you were talking as well. As we move forward, one continent in which we have done a lot of work but we haven't talked about is Africa. Mm-hmm. So when you're future-proofing, you talked about critical minerals, you talked about supply chains, you talked about a lot of things. So how do you see the role of Africa and India emerging over the next decade?
Thanks, Vish, again asking for the question. See, the Africa, we have to see that today the Africa has evolved. It's become more aspirational. So the two trends that come to mind quickly, one is that the development for Africa and development by Africa. So it doesn't want to have the tag of a recipient continent of just aid dependent. So Africa today is on a trajectory of creating its own, taking the destiny in its own hand. The two important trends here. One is the Agenda 2063, which is industrialization of Africa. The second one is Africa-wide Free Trade Continent Agreement, which talks about the value addition and collapsing its own internal standards and internal tariffs. So it's going to create a huge market. Now, where does India fit in? Traditionally, we've been sending goods from India to that part of the continent in a very classical sense of cross-border trade. But I think that thinking has to change, because we have to create part of the manufacturing on the African continent to be able to create that value. And why that's important? It's both ways. It's a win-win, because you're creating scale, you're able to take over the larger market in the region, and secondly, the jobs for Africa are very important. There are many things that we can do like this, agriculture, food security for Africa, energy that I mentioned about. Africa is endowed with huge critical minerals that actually the world needs. Any country that wants to position itself in the 21st century would need to imperatively partner with Africa, in my view, because those resources that it has is unique. And for us, if I look at geographically, it's very close to us. So in my view, partnering with Africa is important. The next opportunity we'll have is India-Africa Forum Summit. Very soon we will be able to host it, hopefully in the second half of next year. Then we can build a roadmap for that.
So you do feel that Africa has an important role in terms of when we future-proof our growth in terms of its...
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that.
You've been talking about global supply chains and regional supply chains, and one of the things that came to my mind when you're talking about it is the India-Middle East Economic Corridor. Do you think that's something which would help? I mean, things like that would help in building these value chains, or do you think it's the FTAs and the others which would help in building the supply chains?
I think we have to see it in a more holistic sense, because trade, even though you might have a very robust and ambitious FTA, you still need to send the goods across. So you need connectivity. So the connectivity is fundamental in the way these goods will move. And the faster it moves, is better. And in the recent times, the connectivity projects have become very important. Many countries are driving the connectivity projects, but let's come to the focus on IMAC. Now, IMAC has many players. But definitely the first leg of the IMAC, which is coming from India to UAE, that's a very important part, and a lot of work and discussions are happening. But a significant part is going through the landmass of Saudi Arabia, and then it goes through the Europe. But so we'll have to see the stability of the region in days to come and how it will evolve. But in my view, there's a lot of scope for both sides and all players in the game. So IMAC has many partners. So one is the manufacturing across the corridors can happen. The digital infrastructure is another area. And when I see the economic prosperity across IMAC, it will also bring stability in a politically volatile and sensitive area. Sorry.
I think one of the things which when you look at any strategic partnership with any country, you would know this better than me, but trade, investment, and security are the three main pillars when we look at a strategic partnership, I suppose. So we're leaving out security, but if you're looking at trade and investment, what's happened between India and the US and the rest of the world has changed the way trade is looked at. Do you see this now setting a new standard in terms of how trade and value chains and FTAs would now emerge, and in terms of if you're looking at the future? Or do you think this is just a blip and things would again go back to normal?
I think we have to understand that trade, goods and services in isolation, it doesn't gel in this today's world of trade in a broader sense of it. There is a linkage between trade, investment, technology, all these factors are there. Now what United States is trying to do is raising the tariff. We're not sure where it will lead to, but it's definitely disrupting the current the trends and the flow of trade. But it is harming both the United States and also the world. And that's how it will happen eventually, because you're shooting in the foot by raising the tariffs. It makes more expensive to manufacture your own goods. And secondly, inflation. The inflation means the greater the inflation, the people will not be able to buy the goods they want to buy. So then you will eventually move into recession. The two important events in history in the recent times, in the 21st century, the financial crisis of 2008, and then you had COVID. Both times we've seen that actually the global growth had plunged to a significant level. And today, if the Trump high tariffs persist, you will see another dip. And a dip will be very costly for the world economy. It's almost like, when in Europe, there's the saying that when France sneezes, the whole of Europe catches cold. It's like this. The United States is a very large economy. It almost imports $3 trillion worth of imports. So a lot of markets around the world will face trouble because of these tariff issues.
Before I move to other questions, Chetan, just want to ask you, I'll just come to you in a second.
So, just a quick one, Secretary Ravi. This is primarily around the fact that, we need to grow at a steady clip of 8%, as you sort of outlined in your speech. Do you think as a nation we are being overly optimistic? You spoke about a 50 million jobs backlog that exists. Are we sort of not clearly recognizing, these aspects in our overall growth narrative?
Well, the challenges for us are many, and I think the backlogs notwithstanding, we had to keep trying. In my view, so we have to also we should not underestimate the creative talent of Indians and the entrepreneurship. But somewhere down the line, I believe that our policies have not really unleashed the entrepreneurship of an individual. Today, a large number of Indians who are also businesses, they're traders. It's a mindset that has to shift to be an entrepreneur. And that is where I believe is the policy orientation has to focus more on creating individuals to be an entrepreneur. And Prime Minister said it, that we have to take risks. If you are thinking big, risk is inherent in that ambition. So I know that many of the existing businesses will face disruption when you're looking at that kind of a trajectory of creating entrepreneurship in the country. But that's a call. We have to see, and we have to see a long-term trajectory and the growth of the nation. And all the disruptions and the short-term pain is part of it. You have to accept it as normal. So I don't see why we cannot create individual entrepreneurships. Why today intelligent, bright people have to go to the job market for a job? Why can't they be entrepreneurs themselves? The startup culture is very good, but it has to be nurtured. So a lot of factors matter here: access to capital, access to capital with low interest rates, creating the condition, the ecosystem, the plug-and-play concepts, and encouraging more and more youth to take that risk. I think that's an important part of your growth story.
I'm not going to ask you an Africa-related question for a change second.
That's why I asked the question first.
How do we safeguard? I'm asking you this question very specifically as a corollary to what Vish had asked you. How do you safeguard the services sector and ensure continuous access to the US, considering the way the tariffs are being focused, particularly the services sector?
We'll take a few questions. Yes, Raman.
Dammuji, I have a question for you. Just a very quick comment before I come to the question. You talked about Africa. You talked about going to Africa and actually doing things on the ground there. You talked about exports being important for the country. Till 2008 meltdown, exports as part of the GDP were a very, very small portion. They've risen to about 21-22% now. So that's a significant jump. Now, having said that, Africa is not the easiest country. They are a repository, as you rightly said, of a huge amount of natural resources. We Indians have tried, including some of our telecom companies, to go there. It's not a very easy region to traverse, and the support that we need from our government there is not sufficient. There is we tried to bid for oil resources in Gabon. Most of Africa is better disposed to India than to China. And they were very happy if that deal had gone to India. But we have a system that for every increase in the bid, you have to refer back to South Block or somewhere to get an approval to make a rebid. Now, that does not work efficiently in a competitive M&A situation. We lost that. We lost an IT city outside Addis Ababa, despite years of a fantastic diplomatic relationship between Ethiopia and India. How do we solve these issues unless we are nifty enough and quick off our feet with government support to actually start doing something effective in Africa?
Thanks, Raman. I'll just take two more questions, if it's okay. Anita? Yeah, next. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Anita Kumar. I'm part of Cisco. My question is two parts. One is, what do you believe would be the lessons learned from the India-UK FTA that can be leveraged for the upcoming trade agreement negotiations? And the second part is, again, taking forward from the first question, what would be the, according to you, three main areas or three main focus areas for the India-US trade agreement negotiation?
Come to Louis, and then I'll come to the rest of you, please. I'm just coming to Louis just a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. That was a lovely session. Could you also talk a bit about trade with the neighboring countries and how the government sees that growing as a potential to influence our neighboring area?
Maybe you answer some of them and then.
First question, third question are somewhat I can bring in together. So on the services sector, we have to say that where we will see the stress levels. My view is in the DPDP. We have the Digital Privacy Act, which is in a way will come in the way between your services exports to the United States. What does that say? It's a localization of service and data localization versus the cloud computing. So the debate will go on for some time, but we'll have to see how we can navigate that challenge, because the two are very different. And then there is also how efficiently you're able to provide services through your own server localization versus the cloud computing. But there is an interlinkage. A lot of our services sector have a lot of US interests and linkages. Look at in the same way, the global capability centers that are there in India, a lot of them are located in India. So it's two ways. So if they are looking at setting up GCCs more and more in the R&D and the services areas, so you'll have to see a seamless facilitation of that. So it's like in the days to come, and particularly in this age, the data, which Harari said, it's the new oil. Data will become fundamentally a very, very important area for countries and how you manage the data. So this debate will go on, but in my view, you have the capabilities, you have the workforce, you have the knowledge centers that will set up in India. We'll have to be very nimble-footed. We'll have to be a lot more thinking through and anticipating change to come. For example, look at the digital taxation that we've always said, we will not allow free flow of digital goods in India. Now, what Trump yesterday announced is the same. He's also going to put the taxation on the digital products coming into the United States. Now, this is a very dangerous game. Now, what will happen is, countries start to put restriction on the seamless movement of digital products, which is going to be the most important arena for trade in the future, and economy's competitiveness that will determine. China will be at an advantage because it will still have, China is not that easy because still not an open economy, but it will be at an advantage position, and many of our industries will face challenges in the days ahead. The Africa, Raman Sidhu mentioned about Africa, naturally it's still difficult to do business in Africa. I know it's not easy, but let's understand our own thinking of how industry looks at opportunities outside. Today, when I interact with our industry, they're not keen for any risk-taking. They want EPC projects, they want O&M projects, execute and get out. But that's not, you need to have the skin in the game. So you need to have the staying power in a region. And that is where you have to have a lot more strategic thinking when you're entering a region. And that, I believe, is the limiting factor. Not having that is a limiting factor. So we have to inculcate. Now, how do you get them to do that project? I think the government will have to do a lot of hand-holding. Foreign Office and many other related departments will have to handhold. And the key thing is access to finance. Now, we've been thinking about how do I create, just not the Exim Bank funding, but how do I create a fund that is able to support Indian entrepreneurs to be able to do that kind of business. Now, look at China. Almost everything is supported by the state to do that kind of large infrastructure projects. We'll have to somewhat think to bring in that kind of an understanding in how you position yourself in Africa. There is a lot of opportunities. In my view, if Indian entrepreneurship, I'm very confident that if you encourage them and nudge them a bit, they will be able to take that calculated risk. And we need to be there in the game. As much as it takes, you need to be there. So there is and the second element that we haven't really thought in the equation when you talk about Africa is the diaspora. You have 3.2 million people who are very prosperous, stable, and we haven't synergized that energy and talent to our advantage. So many countries don't have this. So that connect will have to strengthen to be able to reap a lot more benefit, but both sides, both for India and Africa, doing projects, doing trade, sourcing from India, then I'm looking at not just funding part of it, but also in terms of trade settlement in national currency. That's another thing that we're working on in the government, that how do I get more countries to be able to do, no, I won't say de-dollarization, but an alternative payment mode, which is through the fintech, through payment gateways, and countries be able to do trade settlement and even projects in their own national currency. That's one thing. There's a lot of work in progress on that space. Anita mentioned about India, UK, FTA, and what it holds for us, and what the US is next. We have to be very clear that this is one of the most ambitious FTA that we have signed ever. Not with Australia, not with UAE, even this more, because those are low ambition, having a very small tariff structures, limited. But this is almost 90% coverage, which is very, very significant. But the market size in the UK is small, though. But you also have to understand that if the US-UK FTA fructifies and happens, that's an advantage for us, because that becomes a launching pad in some sense. Now, it also sets a template. What we have done with UK sets a template both in terms of the social security agreement, but also in the tariff coverage. And there are also the standards regulatory mechanisms that we have worked towards easing. All this sets with the standard. But the US FTA, India, will have perhaps even go beyond that, because it's just not a tariff that the Americans will want to tackle. They will have another behind the border issues, including your taxation, including your standards, regulatory frameworks. All of them will have to come in some stage into the arena of negotiation of an FTA. So we have to be mindful of where it is heading to. But we have seen that the biggest FTA that India has ever done is with itself in the 1991. Now, we unilaterally collapsed our own regulatory frameworks and the tariffs. So what it tells us is that embracing globalization, embracing openness is to our advantage. There may be short-term pain and short-term stress that industry will go through, but in the long run, you will see a huge opportunities opening up for the country. South Asia trade, it's an interesting point and very dear to me. I think I begin by saying that normally we have this tendency to think that our own neighborhood is politically sovereign. True, every country is sovereign, ours small or big. But we haven't imagined in a creative way that can they be economically unified or economically integrated. That is an understanding we have to bring in when you think about South Asia as one. So that, I believe, has to gain strength while you respect the sovereign equality of all the nations, but you have to think more in terms of unifying economically your own region. And how does it happen? Your connectivity, we should be able to think that how do I push the Delhi-Mumbai corridor up to Kathmandu? How do I push the Calcutta corridor into Dhaka? How do I see that Vizhinjam port is connecting seamlessly with Sri Lanka? Now, these are the ideas are very important for us. We have to also analyze that tomorrow the South Asian countries will also enter into deep agreements with many countries around the world. And that's already happening. Can I take advantage of a launching pad from these regions to other part of the world? But there is today the sentiment of protectionism. The more I open up, I'll expose my industry to competition. It's not good. But that is a call at the policy level that we have to push our industry to be competitive and globally outreaching. I think that's, if we are able to do it, we can. The second part of it is we have to generate more manufacturing in our South Asian countries. Today we haven't done it. We are only doing a few projects here and there. But enough manufacturing has not happened by Indian companies in the South Asian region. So that is again because we feel that our market needs to be protected. No, we have to see the whole South Asia as a one market. And we, being a dominant economy, out of $32 billion of trade, where 98% is Indian exports to the region. So you have to think in a much more dynamically, and this input should come from industry, because industry more often says, no, don't take from your own regions, don't open up to it. So that's a food for thought. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Secretary Sir. My name is Bhavna. I'm coming back to the question and the conversation around India's mineral security and the fact that we've highlighted Africa, but I also wanted to get an understanding on our thinking around Latin America and Australia, because when it comes to reserves, these are the areas that are rich in lithium, which is the new gold. And so how are we, while we have been strengthening and some conversations at the G2G level are happening there, we just wanted to also understand how are we contouring that relationship, these two relationships.
Thank you. You had a question, sir? You had a question? Yeah. Thanks. Secretary, I could relate to every point of yours in the opening remarks. I think military strength giving way to economic strength, the need for exports, the interlinkage between trade, investment, and technology, and actually closely linking to clean energy also. And I could also relate to what Deepshikha said, that there are areas where the private sector and businesses have to take the front lead, and there are areas where the government has to step in and provide guidance and some active hand-holding. I come to that point which you also made about securing supply chains in rare earth metals. Today the situation is that even as we are aspiring for exports being, I should say, cushion ourselves from domestic growth pangs so that we have a good growth, we target exports. The biggest bottleneck that seems to come is from global supply chains. China today controls 70% of rare earth and maybe 90% of magnets. And if they start controlling that, the whole auto industry could come to a grinding halt. That is something that the private sector cannot handle on its own. How can the government help us there? And then we just have one more question.
Good morning, Secretary. This is a wider question and more eminent in the current situation. So clearly, India's got its horses together from a growth of infrastructure, overarching plans around economy. Now, in the time of conflict, what is the kind of message, and a far more detailed message, as a collaborated audience that we should be giving?
I think we are focusing just on the economy, not on the conflict.
No.
So, yeah.
At the time of conflict, when it comes to the economy and when it comes to companies talking to our counterparts on the outside, is there any framework or any insight on how we are able to, put something together to ensure that, such conflicts are managed and de-risked better? I'm not sure if I explained it properly, but I think what I'm trying to say is that perhaps we could also, as a community, look at a framework to ensure that our economy continues to be de-risked.
The Bhavna's question on critical minerals, and so I think there's somewhat Rahul's also is you have your question supply chains, and no, we have to have a very deep thinking on how this will impact. Now, what is the shortcoming? In my view, the shortcoming was, I must be very honest, that we never thought that this is the most critical elements in the new technology that will shape the competitiveness in the world. Perhaps, we were all sleeping. And I must say, both at the policy level, the industry level, we were, some kind of a situation where, this never occurred to us. Kamato's kind of but the point is, the Chinese have thought about it even 2 decades ahead of the world. Not just India, but ahead of the world. Even the Americans in the West, they never really focused much on the critical minerals and the role they played. Now, what happens? With 70% gone in there, it's controlled by them, 90% processing, they are effectively able to play, switch off, switch on kind of a role. And today, the trade wars, if the tariffs versus the critical minerals, they can play this game, neutralizing each other. Now, point of fact is, where are we? That's the question. Our industry, in my view, again, I'll broadly say that we were in the commodity space. The big industry, mostly in the commodity space, hadn't evolved into technology space. And that was, we have to recognize, that the industry evolution has to be naturally moving in that space of commodity to technology. It has not happened in the case of India, which is why we never thought that that is so important and critical for it. Today, there is that concern, and industry shifting from the internal combustion engine to the EVs. You're talking about the solar, gigawatt scale of work. This is coming into the center stage of the debate today in the economy. It should have happened some time ago. But there again, the more and more industry will depend on it, this will become a challenge for us. So what government has done in the recent past is Kabul empowerment. The Ministry of Mines has an arm, an institution which is going around and scouting for critical minerals. But that's not enough. I still feel you have to push the private sector into the game of securing critical minerals. So again, the risk averseness, why do you have to go and invest in some mine and then face the trouble of uncertainties and political risk? These issues will come up. But then if you are looking at a vibrant EV sector industry that will become competitive, now with the tariffs under UK coming down on the automobiles, this becomes very important for each industry. So they have to naturally secure. But there are lessons how we can do it. The oil industry has done very well. They went and invested outside and secured for themselves oil and gas, and there is some kind of energy security. But we have to have the same thinking. We have to empower both the private sector and the public sector enterprises to go and secure critical minerals. And not necessarily that you will be able to immediately process and benefit out of it, but secure it and keep it for yourself. This should be part of the strategic thinking. That something is happening on those lines, but I believe the pace at which we are doing is not enough. We have to scale it up. Now, in terms of the supply chains of the critical minerals, I know the auto industry today is facing, but perhaps we'll have to incentivize the industry to secure the supply chains. Let's say DRC Congo or the Angola. Many countries actually want India to step in, to come in as a balancing player. When you have a large presence of one country in that, which is also not good for sovereign right of a country. So it is important that India steps in. But again, policy level, I think we have to have a lot more thinking and how do we drive this. The conflict, Swati has mentioned about the conflict area, how do we deal? Actually, security and development and economic growth are highly interlinked concepts around the world, just not in India. So in a conflict situation, naturally industry will recoil and will keep on one side and take time for the situation to improve. We should remain hopeful that the existing conflict does not escalate. It will subside, the wisdom will prevail on both sides to negotiate at some stage and then have a ceasefire. We should hope for that. But till then, I think the industry will do what it thinks is right, which will normally not want to take risk in this at this time. So we'll have to wait for the situation to improve.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi, for your very comprehensive answers. I now hand over to Chetan for the vote of thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Secretary Ravi and Vish. That was an interesting exchange and a lot of interesting nuggets of information and sort of debate. And very clearly the march of globalization cannot be stopped. It has been, in fact, rapidly accelerated by the tech revolution, as you said, triggering a tectonic shift in global trade. And as you said, it has moved away from a transatlantic kind of a landscape to a trans-Pacific focus. Also, the fact of the matter is that geopolitics today is indistinguishable from geoeconomics, very clearly. And technology is, again, driving competitiveness at an unprecedented scale, even as a paradoxical rise in nationalism sweeps across the globe. And you did touch upon the importance of supply chain and how India perhaps lacks in that area. And there is a need for us to really beef up, our sort of competitiveness in this area. The conversation around rare earths, critical minerals, again, I thought was extremely interesting, right? You have one country that controls 70% of the resources, and you just dread what the future looks like if, economies don't come together to sort of de-risk that entire, challenge. Also, I think the one very important point that you made is to, sort of catalyze entrepreneurship, right? How do we ensure that we work closely with the government to solve the jobs issue? And perhaps the answer there is to provide more access to capital and ensure that we have policies that really spawn entrepreneurship and sort of businesses. And, in short, the need for India to be resilient, the need for India to think locally, in terms of sort of creating regional hubs of trade, I think was very clearly brought out. Thanks a lot, again, for spending time with us and sort of giving us your views on some of these critical issues. Thanks.
We're going to have short break for 15 minutes. The speakers for the next session are already here. Have our tea, coffee, and be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.